there is that famous saying by Christ on the cross, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I'm prepared to forgive Putin if he stops immediately, if he pulls his troops out as my peace declaration has required, and if he apologises and makes reparation to the Ukrainian people. And all this hysterical justification that's going on in the internet and so on, and his propaganda television channels, that all has to stop. There is no justification for this attack on Ukraine. It is an independent country, and they have the right to determine their own future under their elected president, Zelensky, in my opinion, and I think history will bear out. There is another interesting thing I want to mention, which is I heard a debate at the Oxford Union by Sir Tom Sawyer, who was head of MI6 in Britain. He's now independent. He's not a paid-up member of any, British Secret Service, and I can discuss what he said, therefore, with an open mind. But he addressed the Oxford Union in the beginning of March in an interesting discussion. I have a question for Mr. Sawyer, who was head of MI6 back in the Blair years. I want to ask, if what I said is true, if it is the case that British intelligence failed to stop the biggest information assault on Britain ever in history during the Brexit referendum, if it is true that it was a military-style operation run by Russian military intelligence, and I believe it is true, and I believe it can be proved to have been true, and if it is true that that military-style information campaign then caused the Brexit result to go in Russia's favour, if they swung it and interfered with our democracy, why didn't British intelligence pick up on that? Why weren't we robust and able enough to counteract that? So it's the biggest intelligence failure in British history, I would say, without a doubt. And secondly, having discovered that later, presumably, there are people in MI6 or whatever who've read the facts, who've read Compromat, who've read Timothy Snyder's work, who've read my work, who've listened to my talks and so on. Presumably the penny's finally dropped with people like John Sawyer. So why haven't they subsequently gone to Her Majesty and said, look, Elizabeth, we're terribly sorry, we have to report the worst ever intelligence failure in British history. We let the Russians take us out of the European Union against our national interests. And this is how it was done, and this is who did it. Oh, and they've also taken control of the Conservative Party. We're terribly sorry, Your Majesty, but we have to report this as a matter of constitutional duty. After all, the intelligence services are supposed to protect Britain's national security interests. They didn't. They let the show down. So I think it's time for them to come clean and say to Her Majesty, look, sorry, you've got a corrupt Russian plant as a Prime Minister. You have to sack him. And all his team, the Rishi Sunaks, the Priti Patels, they're all in the pay of these anti-British infiltration, oligarchical, Putin-esque, diabolical, bots that have taken over our country. So at what point, constitutionally, is that a requirement from, if I was Her Majesty, I'd want to hear the truth. I'd want to be told, oh really, and at that point she should simply sack this whole bunch. I mean, she still has the constitutional authority to do it, and although she's getting on and a bit frail, she has the duty to sack this current Conservative government, and it'd be nice to see her do it. But anyway, that's a question I have for Sir John Sawyer. What about the left? I just want to mention something else I've discovered, which I find very, very disheartening. I was brought up in Kemptown in a kind of left-leaning Labour voting household, Fabian Society. I used to belong to the Fabian Society, kind of, in which politics was a decent game. You were on the side of the poor and you wanted a better society, so you voted Labour. You were on the side of the rich and wanted to keep everyone down in their place, you voted Tory. But there were certain ground rules in the 60s. What I hadn't realised, you see, I've never understood why Corbyn and the Labour Party didn't absolutely oppose Brexit, realising it's against all our national interests. Why didn't Corbyn, support, and Keir Starmer, a second referendum? Why didn't they support the Liberal Democrats who were jumping up and down playing the whistle on the constitutional crisis we were facing? Why didn't they work out a common platform to stand at the last election in 2019 to defeat the Tories together? The Lib Dems, Labour, Green, Plaid Cymru, SNP had all stood as one progressive force on the mandate of a second referendum. They would have won hands down in my opinion, and still would if they did that. The next election, they won't win until they do, in my opinion. Well, why wasn't that done? And I've been, puzzling over this, because many of my good friends are members of the Labour Party, my sister and so on, they support it. Well, I now know why. Through the research done by Timothy Snyder and others, it turns out that the man in charge of communications for the Labour Party under Corbyn, a man called Seamus Milne, was a hard left Putinist apologist and a Stalinist apologist, which is ironic given that his father, Alistair Milne, was a very good Director General of the BBC and moderate kind of, intelligent man. He sent his son, Seamus, to Winchester College, where some of my friends studied, and Michael Brown was a teacher, a friend of our family. So I love Winchester. It's a great school. My friend Douglas Lyne was educated there. But it obviously didn't educate this guy Seamus Milne very well. He did a sort of flip. He turned into a rabid Maoist, actually. He went on to Balliol College. How could he not understand the horrors of what Mao had done to China? Had he never read the Black Book of Communism? Had he never studied the actual biography of Mao? Well, obviously not. I mean, unless he was faking the whole thing right from day one, sort of a plant, infiltrating the extreme left on behalf of MI5, which is, not impossible, actually. If he was genuine and becoming an actual Maoist, then the guy was brain challenged, in my opinion. Because the minute you actually read what Mao did to the Chinese and to the Tibetans, you realise he was a horror, he was a nightmare. I've described the horrors of what Stalin did. Well, Stalin was even frightened of Mao, because when Stalin gave Mao the bomb in the 50s, early 50s, and Mao starved the Chinese people to get the bomb. Millions died in famines just so they could get nuclear weapons. Stalin said to Mao, look, okay, you can have the nuclear weapon, it's very important, you can join the big boys club, but you must promise me not to use it, right? There are certain things we can't do. And Mao said to him, yeah, I can't make that promise, because you see, I'm not afraid of a nuclear war against the West. If America and China go to war, well, we'll bomb them, and we've got far more people than them, so we'll win, because there's only 200 million of them. We can kill that lot, and then there'll still be 400 million of us left. So China can out-bomb the Americans. And when Stalin heard that, he was terrified. What have I done? I've just armed a monster with nuclear power weapons, and he might use them. And apparently it led to Stalin having a stroke, which is why he died. This is given in the biography of Stalin, that information I've just shared, by Simon Sebag Montefiore, who wrote a very detailed study of the Red Tsar, the Stalin's years in power, as well as an earlier one on Stalin's youth, both of which are really, really interesting, worth reading. So Stalin found Mao scary in his capacity for evil. He also discovered something else, that Stalin wasn't even a proper Marxist. That Mao wasn't even a proper Marxist. He confessed in the villa, the Dacha, where he was in Russia, that he'd never actually read Marx or really understood it. He was just doing it to promote his work as a bandit chief in the early days. So, yet Seamus Milne obviously knows nothing about this. I don't know who taught him at Balliol. I mean, I taught at Oxford myself. Who on earth were his tutors? Why did they let him get away with this kind of... Apparently he shifted away from Maoism and became a Stalinist in his Balliol years. I thought the people that taught PPE, which he studied, were fairly intelligent. I mean, I was taught by people that Plaminats used to work at Oxford. Well, I can't believe this guy Seamus Milne got through Winchester and Balliol and still was stuck in the Stalinist kind of worldview. But then he got a job at The Guardian, right? And he was a friend with Richard Gott, who was a friend of mine when I was in the Labour Party back in the 80s. In Notting Hill Gate, Richard Gott lived up the road, and his wife was part of our little group of Labour members. So I knew Richard Gott, who got into trouble for being too left-wing, had to resign because he knew what the Americans had been doing in Latin America and were very suspicious of it. Richard Gott was a good man, you know, I think. I knew him a little bit. He was a neighbour. Seamus Milne knew him as well. The thing is, and I was studying my history degree at the time and reading, about the horrors of Stalinism and so on. Now, apparently Seamus Milne didn't go through that. He never did a history degree. He never studied what Stalinism actually meant in practice. He stayed at that level of superficial knowledge, avoiding the facts. I mean, my mother was of that same ilk. She'd been a communist. She'd been a apologist for that whole thing, like Seamus was. And she refused to read Solzhenitsyn. When I used to try and tell her, look, Mum, this is what the communists actually did in practice, read it. She couldn't, because her worldview had been set in World War II, when the communist heroes of Russia were helping us defeat Hitler. So they were the good guys of history. And I think Seamus Milne, got also stuck in that, which is unusual for our generation. We're a similar generation, The point is that he then became a great fan of Putin and a supporter of Putin. And if you read about his story, somebody should do a detailed biography of him. And what I'm saying is culled from various sources. Because it was his hatred of the European Union, once he was Director of Communications under Corbyn, that made Corbyn refuse to back anything that might keep us in the European Union. And why was Seamus Milne so anti the European Union? Well, the fact is he's going off and wining and dining with Putin and his circle. And he's got that sort of extreme leftist neo-Stalinist view of anti-imperialism, anti-Europe, anti-capitalism, kind of adolescent worldview. I'm sorry to have to say, it's a frozen leftism, pre-Tony Blair, long pre-Tony Blair. It's drifting out in space, like lost in space, in some kind of bubble that has never studied what Stalinism did in practice, has no clue about what they did to Ukraine, has no clue about what the Gulag did. And how did a man like that get into such a place of power in the Labour Party? What happened to the genuine Social Democrats in the Labour movement? What happened to the Fabians? What happened to the Gateskill tradition of actual intellectual Labour people? What happened to John Smith and his legacy? What happened even to Neil Kinnock, who was not a stupid man? So I think there was a catastrophic intelligence failure inside the Labour Party, which allowed Seamus Milne to get into power and use that power. He's obviously very clever intellectually. He dazzled poor old Jeremy Corbyn, a decent man, but without the brains to see what was going on, and without realising how how this information war was taking us out of the European Union against all our instincts, was simply playing into Putin's hands. Corbyn couldn't figure this out, and it's ironic that he was supposed to be against war, he was part of Stop the War, but they didn't stop the worst military attack on Britain ever, which was an information war. They didn't stop the information war. And in a sense, Seamus Mill was colluding in it by his blocking of any genuine attempts to get the Labour movement as a whole to stop Brexit. He was kowtowing to the extreme right, fanatical, anti-European lobby, which, I'm sorry, but they're all frozen leftists, as I call them. So that's a catastrophe that I've learned in the last month. And I've seen how the British left has lost its way, has lost its soul, and the peace movement as well, the Stop the War movement, in their response to the Ukraine thing, need to really get their act together. They need to hear what I'm saying. They need to listen to philosophers of peace, I'm speaking on behalf of, and realise that it's not enough to just be pro-Putin as a response to this crisis. I hope Seamus Mill goes back to university and does a history degree, and specialises in Russian and East European history as I did. He might realise the horrors of what he's committed. We're in a catastrophic meltdown and yet I don't think it's going to succeed. I don't think Putin's invasion will succeed. I think he will have to withdraw. He must go back. He must see the error of his ways. That man Kirill needs to step down. I mean, how can they have a man exposed as a KGB agent, as the like it's as if Welby turns out to be a MI6 operative. He couldn't last as Archbishop of Canterbury. There are certain things that are acceptable and certain things that aren't. So we need a genuine, peace-loving Christian in charge in Moscow. And we need a genuine, intellectually capable person in charge in the Kremlin. The Russian peace movement needs to really come up now. As my friend Nigel Young has called for, the editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Peace. The Russian peace movement is getting its act together. Well, all power to them. There have to be non-violent, constitutional, legal oppositions to Putin, who is running a cabal that has taken the country into a false war, which is, of course, always the way of dictators. If they want to increase the power of their hegemony, they demonise the other and they send you off to fight them. Well, no, see through that, my dear Russian friends. This is just absurd. So there has to be what I call a period of ethical rebuilding. Not only do we have to rebuild the poor cities of Ukraine and save these people of Mariupol and all the other cities. I mean, they've started shelling Lviv now, which is shocking and disgraceful. Once this is over, and I hope it will be shortly, and Russia withdraws, then there has to be a rebuilding, but it's an ethical rebuilding that has to happen globally. In America, healing from the Trump catastrophe. Americans have to understand how Trump was foisted on them by Russian military intelligence. There has to be a rebuilding, an ethical rebuilding in Britain, as the British people have to realise that Brexit was foisted on us by Russian intelligence, military intelligence. There have to be, this is a total ethical rebuilding that has to happen. The Scottish people have kind of known this all along. That's why they opposed Brexit, and good luck to them. They deserve their second referendum on independence. The Welsh people have realised that this was a scam. My dear Welsh friends, where I lived happily for, nearly 10 years, have woken up. And so this ethical rebuilding, that's kind of where I come in as a philosopher, trying to say, well, how do we do that? What are the clues? What can we trust anything now? How do we work out what we can trust? Where's truth gone? Well, that's what I've been working for as a philosopher. That's why I'm a great believer in Kant and the intellectual tradition of European philosophy. That's why I've written Being of Knowledge and published a book on ethics. we can reconstruct in this mayhem, and we can go back to the trusted classical sources of European civilization. We can reread Plato. We can understand why Socrates stood up to the fake jury that sentenced him to death, because he believed in the immortality of the soul, and he knew that the true judge of history is not whoever's running the cabal at the moment, the Putin of the day. It's the court of history that we're answerable to. There is a very interesting tradition, I would just say, in response to the Eurasian lot. There's a very important book called Red Shambhala that I've read recently by a historian in America about attempts by the very early Bolsheviks to kind of marry communism up with Vajrayana Buddhism, with Buddhist ideas, and Tantric Buddhism and Vajrayana. And so they hoped for a sort of spiritual reformation of Russia that would be non-violent. Buddhism is a non-violent religion, and Nicholas Roerich was part of this movement. To me, that's genuine Eurasianism, which is the marrying up of the best parts of Asian culture and philosophy with the best parts of European. I mean, I love Nicholas Roerich's work. I love genuine Russian and European intellectuals who look at the East. I'm a great fan of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky is a typical Russian intellectual who was a polymath of occultism, and her friend Colonel Olcott from America. It was an attempt to build an international intelligentsia of intelligence to try and unite and synthesize the wisdom traditions of the world into an overarching, not just Eurasian, but universal wisdom lineage. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And although the exponents of Red Shambhala were killed by Stalin, they were all executed. And the book goes into this in detail, because they were too intelligent, and what Stalinism does, it ruled through the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt says. So it killed off intellectuals by the thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands. So we have to rebuild the intellectual life of the world, and not let it happen again. We can't let Putin get away with this reversion to Stalinism. And that's why in my doctoral thesis, which I hope you will read, and others who want to know the details of where I'm coming from, then study my theory of transpersonal peace history, which I did in my PhD. What I'm arguing is that we aren't going to get peace truly on this planet till we synthesize and marry up the transpersonal yearnings of all humanity. It's not like Christianity has to win, or Buddhism, or Judaism, or paganism, or any other kind of ism. It's we have to find the common universal heart of them all. And that's why I produced my periodic table, which I'll come back to. And that's why I'm teaching a course on enlightenments. You see, I think the solution to this crisis the world is facing, and the way to ethically rebuild back, is through, getting our books back out, getting on the meditation mat, studying with the teachers, and finding out what is enlightenment for me personally, for you, for all of us. Because I don't want, the other way is an endless series of unresolvable wars and conflict. You see, wars and conflict emerge when we aren't enlightened, when our unenlightenment triumphs over our enlightened mind. That was Buddha's point, and he's right. And it was Mahavira's and all the other great yogis and spiritual teachers, including the Druids. The Druids had their own lineage of enlightenment. And what I'm going to be looking at in the course is how these different schools of enlightenment compare and contrast. Say the Christian, the Jewish, the Muslim, they all have an equivalent to enlightenment. What is it? How do we activate it? How do we actualize it? Because that's I think, the only hope. I mean, politicians are arguing about, oil and gas and who owns access to which and so on. The greatest resource, the one we die without, is enlightenment. And we all actually can access that. We all have oil wells of enlightenment in our house, in our garden, in our hearts. And we can access that That's what we'll look at in the course. I'm teaching it with Satyen Raja, a great colleague in Canada who's been studying Enlightenment practice for years. We're co-teaching this course. And we're going to look at all the existing models and schools. We're going to be using the, the periodic table. An example I want to share is a great Enlightenment Zen master called Huang Po, who he was lived in China in the 7th century, in the Tang period of Chinese history. And he's an example of the kind of enlightenment that we're going to be looking at. He died in 849, and a lot of the Zen traditions go back to Huang Po, who realised that enlightenment is simply plugging into the cosmic mind. And there's only one cosmic mind behind everything and everyone, and every culture and every religion and every language. It's that Zen mind of enlightenment that is everything. And so once we find that, our hatred of the other goes, because we're from the same mind. We're literally part of each other. And so he practiced what became known as the Mokusho Zen, the silent mind meditation, in which you actualize and realize this enlightenment. Some of his disciples developed the koan idea, that you meditate on the words that cannot say the whole, and so you go beyond them, but you end up at the enlightened mind either way. So he's an example. Another example I'll be looking at is Huang Xuanzang, who was a great explorer from China, who travelled all the way to India. And he lived from 602 to 664 AD, back in the day in Tang Dynasty China. He started his education as a Confucianist and a great philosopher and sage. But he became very interested in Buddhism, and he studied the Buddhist scriptures and got very interested. And he spent time at Nalanda, the university, studying, where I've visited. It's now ruins, but spiritually it lives on. And Xuanzang, he wanted to go to Nalanda, to India, and he walked from China through Central Asia in an epic journey. He wrote an autobiography later. And he came to India, and he met the ruler of India at the time, a man called Harsha Vidharma, who was the ruler of North India, and who himself was very interested in Buddhism. So Xuanzang studied in Nalanda, and he brought back amazing numbers of texts to China. Harsha Vidharma was the ruler who respected Xuanzang's visit to India. And that, to me, Harsha Vidharma, who ruled from a city capital state, now it's a town called Kanauj. It's on the Ganges, kind of halfway between Benares and Delhi. It's sort of on the Ganges there. I've not been, but I'd love to go. Archaeologists have been exploring it. And that at that time was the most important city in northern India. It was written about by the great Chinese explorer. And he stayed in India for 16 years studying. And then he went back to China and translated these texts. He was particularly interested in the Yogacara school of Buddhism, the mind-only school, which is the one that got me interested in Buddhism when I was studying at Bristol University years ago. Yogacara school. And towards the end of his life, he was visited by a Japanese sage who came and took that school to Japan. Dosho was his name. And it became one of the most important Japanese schools of Buddhism. So this is the sort of lineage of enlightenment transmission that I think is very important, and that's just to give examples from the Buddhist tradition. But we will be looking at this, what's the equivalence to those Enlightenment traditions, say among the Christians, or among the Jews, or among the Muslims, or among the pagans. What do we know about it? How can we recover those Enlightenment traditions and lineages? What I think we need is enlightened rulers on the planet. Where's our Harshavardhana now? Where are genuine, intellectually humble but acute leaders who can stop the madness? Obviously we can't look to people like Putin, who are warmongers. We can't look to these Marine Le Pen, these sort of neo-fascists. We can't look to Nigel Farage and his neo-fascist lot. We can't look to Boris Johnson, who's a tool of all these neo-fascists. No, we can look to genuine people like Ed Davey in England, who's a humble and a good man. We can look to Macron, who's doing a good job in France. We can look to Pierre Trudeau, who has just addressed the European Parliament, who's a Canadian Prime Minister, and I'm a dual Canadian-British citizen, so he's my other Prime Minister. And we can look to Biden, I think, who although he's made many mistakes in the past, he's been blindsided on, like all American politicians, he's making the right calls now, I believe, in realising that the fight for Ukraine is a fight for the soul of democracy. And he knows how wicked and evil Trump was, and how he's a good man, is old Biden. He got married in the United Nations chapel, which I've also sat and prayed in. He's an internationalist at heart, and that's why he realises what's at stake. But he's not an intellectual heavyweight. I mean, we need a new generation of enlightened leaders to come forward to stand up against the evil of these simplistic neo-fascists like Trump and Farage and Marine Le Pen and Putin, that their speech is filled with hate if you listen to them. It's all common, at least they're consistent, they hate the West. Well, thank you, I am the West. I'm a Canadian-British dual citizen, I'm part of what Dugan calls the Sea Empire. Okay, so you can hate me, but I'm actually quite lovable, really. I'm not, I just want peace and love and democracy and enlightenment for everybody. As a Democrat, I want to give knowledge away. Does that make me hateful? I mean, and I'm just typical of the millions of people that actually have got a proper higher education and know what's what. Because in my society, we're allowed to find out stuff. Thanks to people like Beveridge and the founders of the University of London, Jeremy Bentham, we actually are entitled to a higher education. And, that then gives a duty to tell the truth. I think that if we have enlightened leaders, what we need to do is come up with a global peace plan. We can't have selective peace. We can't have Biden saying, yeah, let's save Ukraine. Oh, meanwhile, we'll sell bombs to Saudis. They can massacre the Yemeni people. No, we can't. We have to have a global peace plan, right? I'm addressing any potential Harshavardhanas out there who might be listening. We have to have a global peace plan that not only stops the war in Ukraine and makes the Russians go back, but also stops the war on Yemen, that also stops the chaos and confusion in other countries around the world, that solves and heals the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a two-state solution they can all be happy about. And I, proposed that in some detail. The Palestinians deserve their own, little state in a non-violence treaty with Israel, so that the Netanyahu types can't lobby and say it's